side is equal to the horns of a rabbit. In other words, the existence on its own side is the same as the horns of a rabbit, something that is impossible, that doesn't exist. Well, programming that doesn't work, because they say something must exist from its own side, because otherwise we couldn't say it is a cause in this particular phenomenon. If it didn't exist from its own side, in a particular point at the table, we cannot say that this particular phenomenon is a result independent on its cause. But this particular phenomenon is small in relation to something big. This particular phenomenon is big in relation to something small. So there's no basis. On the basis we can say, in relation to this, it is this, that, or another. So therefore, there's no basis which we can use on the basis of which we say something something of that phenomenon, which means the pendulum arising would not work if the phenomenon did not exist from its own side.
Kurang ngene meba maina kurang ngene yogo wa mare ta titegla chachi kurang ngene meba inza kurang ngene yuchul yoma kurang ngene yuchulji meba inza shinda yona yore shinda yona yomare si shatudo kurang ngene yuchulji yona shinda mena yore shinda kasa shinda mena 아니 요차루 re shinda mena mere si shatuwa 신나 매네 유버 차로 그래서 코랑 외에 매버 인버 디기 아니 코랑 외에 유출네 코랑 외에 유출 매버 디기 아니 신나 매나 아니 코메 시 따다 샤투베지 신나 매나 코메 시 따다 샤투베지 디 샤투기 요 인자 아니 신나 되 시 따다 레줘야지 신나 되 시 따다 레줘 인자 아니 자체 탐지 아니 태줘야지 어디다
So therefore, since phenomena, so what is the mechanical reason here? So what did they say? So according to the Prasangika school, because something does not exist from its own side, so because the existence by way of from its own side, intrinsic existence is not there, then because there are other phenomena, it can exist. And if the other phenomena were not there, it couldn't exist. So therefore, because phenomena do not exist inherently intrinsically, something other than itself, if it is there, that phenomenon can be there. If something other than itself were not there, it could also not exist. So that means that whatever object there is, it doesn't exist by way of its own nature, but it depends on other things, on things other than itself.
那正是因为有自方无的缘故，所以必须要去关待他者。这个时候呢，才能够说呢，是关待他者，所以才能够说这种关待他者的这种互动。
Since phenomena depend on other things, therefore all actions, all activities are temporal. So all actions, all activities are possible and temporal.
디 고아디 라차나 아니 신이 자식이 치기 답이지 치기 된다 다다를 말로 상의라면 야오면 인지적으로 좀 되는 동안이 시세요. 어디 이치 뒤전에 된다 뭐심부 찍이니 아니 돈이 검제 아니 열심히 내도 차려지고 똥바디 차려지고 말아 참참 똥바지 차려고 하래 야 참참라 아니 치결 되어 있으면 동산에 차려 마시 우주겨 아니 서로 방이 됐어요. 지기 야 지기니 그래서 그래 이 똥바차로 마치디 아니 땡지 저거 좋아가서 치기 땡지 땡지 이모도 상당히 똥바디 남사 차려 것도 땡지라기도
So therefore there's a line, or the two lines from Nagarjuna's group wisdom, so Geshe-la will go into this more tomorrow, but it's basically saying whatever is dependently arisen, that is empty. So this kind of line, Geshe-la is saying he has a friend, he has some companion, who goes over this and tries to recite this, so whatever is dependently arisen must like intrinsic existence. So reciting that in his mind, he tries to really force it, but it just makes him angry.
心里有任何的
But then he's got
他
another
觉得
friend
他就
who
常常在
doesn't have that
想
kind of
说
problem,
着
so it
空
doesn't
气
kind of
空气
annoy him
这些
thinking
空气
about
这
that.
样讲的空气
Whenever he
空
thinks
气
of those
可是
guys,
讲的空气的时候
whatever
有的时候你
whatever
能
is
够生起一点点的
independently
这种理
risen
解，
must
大部分的
lack
时候你就觉得
control.
像是
So they really
什
get
么都没
sense
空
of
空
what
的这样
that
子，
means.
没有办法升起一些什么理解，但是他就一直勉强让自己想的空气空气，就最后呢就有一点好像要忧郁症的这样子的状况。可是另外一个人呢，他在思维不起空性的时候呢，他去思维中论的这一句跟缘起有关的这个计算，那很快的就能够让他心里面升起对于空性的一个理解。
那第几句在呢？他看这是，等这他们让这个呢，他看这都是那这个的是吧？可是给这几种人，学会呢，这呢，俺们广大不多，俺们没事可能。个类这的水气都是，俺热气都是了，俺这个的，俺的这个人都地气都是那了的。但地，俺怕什么的呢？没想到这了。但可能给什么的地了的，但没他，居嘛没他们嘛，说呢，想到这了什么当没呢？可以说呢，广大不多这，但没事可能考虑这的都是呢，俺是什么就可能这的个了，因为俺这单呢，但这俺是的肯定的。코랑기 생기 마마나 세저라 먼저 단어 코르다 다 먼저 코라 그래 아니 신라 그래 코랑기 셈되기 말라 그래 투몬도 전나다 미지라다 다 미지다 다 딜라디 미디기 가르치고 쇼게네 진의 kon다보도 수시도 걸리제 봐 미직되기 지도 걸리제도 도도시나 가지 미직도 하다 다 미다와데 가르스나 거기 삼로디 가르스나 미디 가르스 봐 밑에는 마신 단 디치 걸리자 삼록이 킨 디레마도 삼록이 점에는 가지 미치기 치도 걸리제기도 다디 뭐처고 문제인데 제산다 나이나 마치는 많이 되는 내치도 걸리제 비게제레데 이는 시사고지나 되대면서 생이 미지였다 심진지여 최선이지나 딜레 충원하는 미지여를 딜레 겨충원하는 잡아지여를 디치도 제대기다 잡아지기 된다 다 ngay loma ju khara mi chi gi thanda la ki ta shindal te che che ga shindal pe ma te chi ga de ine die phu de di che na nga la bhengi re se to ta thana di che na nga sunam sa gi kanche de chi ga ding thanda chi di ga ding mi chi do odi thanda la ki ta mi si chi cha za wa ta su sam ta ma ta ya ga li
讲这些内容应该是可以了解，就是就像昨天我们曾经谈过的，从早上一早起来到晚上的睡觉之间。
Okay, so Kishida started like so the whole time explained this. And he said, well, yesterday I talked about this, or before I talked about this idea that from morning to evening, one spends one's entire life for what? For what? For whom am I working? For whom am I working? I'm working for myself, for me. So when we just think for a moment of another person, we don't focus on the self, but another person, just an ordinary person. So what does that person do? From morning to evening, they think I. When we think of this other person, well, this other person, he thinks of himself as I. We say he, or we say she. So actually there's just one common person, one common phenomenon, one entity, that person. So from morning to evening, we work so hard for that one very person. Thinking I, thinking in that moment, I think I. So when we work so hard, right, this object of, when we work so hard for this object of the thought I, for that particular person. So then Geshe-la said, if I take it with respect to myself, I do the same for the benefit of I, Jishikun Pesama. So just in general, when I say I, that's a kind of general explanation. If I'm more particular, if I'm more precise, it's a human being. I'm a human being. If I'm even more particular with regard to this, I'm a son. So for 50 years, I've been working for myself.
所以老师说
So
这
she
样
was
说
saying,
起
well,
来，他
I've
这
done a
50
little bit
年
of
来的
work
人
for
生，
others.
大部分的时候
However, in
都在为
reality,
这一个
there
人
was
在
always
做
some
事情。
kind of
即使中间
intention I
间
had
间
of
好像
kind
也
of
在帮着
receiving
别人
something
来做一
back
些
in
事
the
情，
end,
或
or
者
at
在
least
这边帮别人
accumulating
做一些
merit.
事情的时候，
So there was
就会
always
考虑还是
something,
在想，
some kind
为
of
了这个
reward
人，
that went
这个人
back to
能
the
够为
self.
他
So it's
为了
just this
这个人
I.
能够带来好处
I
或
can
能
just
让
working
顺
for
便帮助
myself.
一点点
So
别
now
人。
try to
所以
think
呢，
along
于
these
是
lines,
呢
but take it to your
我
own
一
self.
直不断在努
Everything
力的
Peter
帮忙
McKenna
人，
has
让
just
他
as
这
just
个
explained,
是的，就
or
是
as
先
has been
做
said,
电商的。
become
老
aware
师
that
做
this
电
is
商的这
true
个
for your
方老
own
师最后
self.
指的是他自
You
己。老
work
师
for
说
your own
那
self
他
your
在举
entire
这个例
life.
子的时候，大家不要只想到他，要想到自己。
要那么呢，我是明我这几个多，应当行，是我这几句，还有呢，怕是了，不下来这个，不马上的上当这个，他地图的没上是个人，亏爸爸地的，阿妈地的，可人爸地的，可蛋蛋的人，我这几句，现在看起如果就可能亏起都个来家了，而且呢是这个当过的是多，米几个，他多现在米几个。 미디라 가르치니 띠짱짱기 치고 섬단 거래. 뒤왔단 거야, 진짜.
Or another way to look at this, let's say you introduce someone, you're introduced to someone, so even if you don't meet this person directly, you put a photograph of Geshe Tupinka in front of you. And someone introduces to you Geshe Tupinka saying, his father is such and such, his mother is such and such, he comes from such and such country. And then you explain, for 50 years he worked just for himself. So only for himself. So the question there arises, why did he just work for himself? So the question should really be asked, why just for himself?
要做的事都是为了他而做呢？
나도 잠만 이걸 드리려는 뜻을 투실해 이거.
Someone who's not used to it, then they kind of get confused about that.
讲这样的话，会
Someone
觉得
who's not
这个人
used to this idea that it's all confused.
지금 딘디 뒤왔다는데 다 배나다 에너지 제니 가르치니 게 지금 쓰이는 다디 이와 체바이나 콜을 강에 주는 디세터 가르치는 체버래. 뒤로다. 강을 뒤다 용도구민도 왔다나 아니 거기에 강을 용도구민도 지버려도 아니 디기 용도 가르치니 좀 지고를 탑시돼. 디기들하는 기부도 친구도 가기도 콜에 디기들하는 기부도 가부도 친구도 지버려도
So we have to ask this question,
为什么
why do we look for our own benefit? When problems arise, why do we work for
为什么
the
这个
I?
人遇到困难，我要帮他？
Try to eliminate them. Well then, because we're happy because we cannot bear to have problems. But then we should say, well, the other person is the same. When they have problems, they cannot bear problems. Or when something happy, when something wonderful happens, so why do we work for our own happiness? Well, because it satisfies us, because it makes us happy. That's the reason we do this. Well, with the other person is exactly the same. They get a sense of contentment, a sense of satisfaction when something good happens to them, and they also feel happy at that time. So they're the same in that way.
다 딘데지니 바 리버땅니 제바제딩이지나 리버땅땅 탈라 다 레더제 이네다 수수수 된다 수수 제거로 왔어. 저기 집에 이네 수수 된다 수수 제거로 왔어. 다 딜렌지 디용거로 와. 다 디지디 고초진이 더블더블지 바게 시당진이 시나 신동기 코랑고에 주디 코랑이 텐저에서 저보다 코랑라 안에 먹어야 부두져야 코랑 가야 저보다 즉 제디거를 신임에서 저지. 시당진이 시나现在进的些呢，长嘛，现在的偏多就讲嘛到14些呢，让的偏多也没多，14些呢，别呢，那老百姓都刚才中呢，老百姓萝卜切过来，米给萝卜切过来，刚白萝卜切过来，刚把了刚才都呢，老白萝卜切过来，sem了刚才都呢，第三都呢，要苏白萝卜切过来，苏白了刚才都呢，sem给萝卜切过来，现在嘛到，可能给切些的有嘛，14些呢。 단위 라베온도 제가 있나요? 아니 되게 다 먼저기 강에실에디 신다 뭐 쉬부지를 때네 아니 강에실마도 수수 짱짱 전대죠 전이 아니 강에실에디 민도 다디 정말 무시 소매들이 미배 그런 중부 안 수부터 단 대바 아니 배디 신시부 예딩이지 아니 미다 심지 춘에서 신나지기를 봐 유샤나 강지 전부 알았어. 디서르지 다 강지 디 매딩이지. 어디 제대로잖아. 아니 14부 제바이나 신 랑신이 내당디 간지 지어래서나 신기 신의 펜다에 디 랑신이 내당 있는이지. 섬당셔 진단 rangi rang the penta se di yong he me ding ji shingi shin the penta ko di rang shingi ne dang yin ding ji o di gi samlo di shu chang de na su su den da su chi bo le se samlo di ne ka ba ja tu wo da
今天呢，我们不断的用理路去追问我们刚才问的这个问题，就是为什么要爱他的时候呢？
So, taking these kind of reasonings, therefore, taking these kind of, asking those kinds of questions and taking those kind of reasonings. So, therefore, most people say, well, if I don't work for my own benefit, so for one's own benefit, oneself has to work. So that kind of idea. So in order to benefit oneself, oneself has to do so. And that's what most people would say in response to the earlier question, why are we always working for our own benefit? So likewise, actually, when you look around in nature, when you look at a tree, for example, actually a tree, when there's water surrounding the tree takes the water for its own benefit. It may dispel insects, etc. It may kind of release chemicals, etc. in order to dispel something that may harm it. So it seems to be some kind of natural kind of situation when one looks around. But actually, whenever one wants to benefit oneself, it's always something else benefiting oneself. In a sense, when Geshe was saying it's always benefiting other, and it's always something else that benefits oneself. For example, in order to release an itch, one takes something other than oneself, the hand, and that releases the itch that the leg may experience. So it may be another part of the body, which then releases a problem in a further different part of the body. Likewise, it may be the consciousness which releases, which takes care of one's own mind, removes one's own problems. It's always something else other than oneself that releases the problem, that kind of dispels the problem, gets rid of the problem. Likewise, also for us to exist, we always need to depend on others. There's always dependence on other living beings, on things surrounding us, other things other than ourselves that we need to depend on. So like as Holmes usually says, if you take a very clever and strong, physically strong person and you put them in some kind of deserted forest or somewhere, well, they cannot do anything because whatever they can do depends on others. So it seems to be the nature of things. It seems to be the natural kind of mode of existence that other things that benefit others. So other phenomena benefit other phenomena. That is just the nature. This is just the nature of things. So then, if one thinks along these lines, if one really thinks about this, one is able to slowly stop, one is able to gradually stop thinking of just oneself.
다 디기 근제들 되게 디섬나 땅인데 아니 미딜라 로바 고고도스 그런데 과라지 제도구면 고고도 미딜라 로바 제만 그런데 과라지기를 나네 저 마서 다 간제 이 단다 디라고에 디조디 다디 섬당다디 조 준준나로 송으로 니마 진이지 섬 니마 하시지 섬당하지 준준나 송나 신지 지부터 제 안 타마들 할리우스 다 미라고 가르도 스티와다로 집어래도 다라나시 대와대와 집어 동네들 집어래도 알아도 대다 작은 말에 안 알아 봤어 렌디 레이브다 세팅네 안 알아 코코로 왔어야지 렌디디 슈심을 레이도
So therefore it seems to be kind of a natural law or kind of a way in which nature is. I mean, this is just the way nature is. Other phenomena help other phenomena. So a phenomenon is helped, benefited by something other than itself. This is just what it is, naturally like. So, but we may take the argument, well, why should I help the other person? You know, he just works for himself. He just works for himself, so why should I help him? So when I know this person needs help,
这个人的事情，
and
这个人只是我自己
he cannot do it
这个
himself,
人的
it's
事
not
情由
actually
我来
honest to react in that way. It's not actually not honest to then say, oh no, he can just do it himself. It's not an honest or sincere kind of response.
说是我的
And
这个
also
人，
in
或者说
Philosophical
他
way
的
of
另外一
life,
个人，这样子来
there is this kind of analysis, like this kind of back and forth about what is the difference between self and others really. And in the end, at the very end, because they're really not the same, but the response that we usually have, like naturally, is that they're not the same. And in the end, all one can say is, I'm myself, I'm me, he's he, he's himself. So it's like the only thing you're left with saying is like, I'm myself, and this person is himself.
这上他第练用的在呢，他我们大餐的是给起你妈给练的了上当用的，安尼我的话是来的，马达马西比乐的我的这么太怎么嘛到，我可能给我呢我认没到。
So, therefore, when coming to that kind of conclusion that we come like, I myself, I'm just I, and this person is himself. So when we come to that conclusion, a person who studied Uma, who studied the Madhyamika, when we think, yeah, I'm just myself, I'm me, and this person is someone else, he's himself. So actually when we think of the I is just merely appearing, is merely thought up by a mind that does not engage that does not engage in analysis and investigation. It's merely thought up by that mind.
这上他累吃出能出去往的钱呢，安尼我认嘛到，安尼能出的爬下来，你出讲单呢，我比你出了，我应不差点了，我比你出了没办法。
So, therefore, I forgot to mention that. So, therefore, it's just that mind thinking. Previously, again, I said, so it's just that mind thinking I. In reality, there is no I. So, again, I said now, this time he said, so when we investigate the way the self exists, the way it appears, so the way it appears to us, there is a self, but it's only without investigating. So, without that mind that just merely, without that self that just merely appears to the awareness, there is no I there in reality.
这上第几的，安尼心有耳朵呢，让这不是真贵的，打了差贵的，安尼可上的来嘛，女王长忙了，打了差别往个中堂的中业的的是，这上打了差贵的早的，让我的是的，他个我可能跟我呢，我真吧，地的土当的这个土呢，但是让这个别多生这样子。
So therefore, with respect to with respect to others, so the reason we just cherish ourselves, so having that attachment to ourselves, and this is something Yana has explained previously, it goes back to the idea, I am I. So there's a sense that I'm really there. So since there's a sense that I'm really there, I exist truly from the side of the I itself. Therefore, there's the attachment and there's the self-centeredness.
아니 랑문의 주버진가다 신의 랑문의 주버진 가와 랑문의 주버진 그어디 디게디 유모 탐지기 자와 지금이다. 다 마디 마랑문 주버진도 유모 탐지기 자와 제 가르레스나 다 디르파기 정말 무시 송주다. 디제 신이 마 송네 다 송당기 토네. 디 고와나 신체바이나 아니 디송고다. 마시에디 위디레스다. 위디. 아니 신의 얘기 예 얘기 유 얘기 땡 얘기 워 얘기 자 얘기 니 로 얘기 자라 말아 팬도 말아 팬메도 시디 마디 위를 차는 것도 왔어 또 위시디 아니 닝부다고 대화다고 지거다 딜레디다 개치쇼디 마디 차는 것도 지사 디야 유경외에 주나 랑경외 주나 따따로 왔다 랑경외 마주바제 아니 타다 위래의 명점이나 시작해입니다. 제가 딜레도 나랑이 문을 주변에 되기 전에 아니 나디 기치쇼 차네다 나를 미비 차바디 게 디경기 아니 신나 삼게 해줘야지. 딘디 인사를.
So therefore we also perceive glasses and pillars and other phenomena. We perceive those as existing truly, as existing inherently. But that is not explained to be the root of all problems. This is not perceived as the root of our attachment, for example. So it is, the root is perceiving the self as inherently existing. So as His Holiness usually explains, the reason for that is His Holiness has a way of explaining that, has a way of explaining why this is so. The reason is that there is a sense that the self, the I, is the center. So to use an English phrase, the center of the universe. So the I is kind of the center, is the innermost essence, is the innermost middle of everything. So therefore everything else is seen in relation to that I, left and right, friend and enemy. Someone benefiting, being a beneficial person, being a harmful person. It's all seen in relation to that very center, which usually used to from words like the heart of everything, the center of it. And therefore the most important thing there is. So if the self would really exist from its own side, would exist from the side of the object, from the side of the self, from the side of the object, it'd be alright. But if it is just mere name, then there's nothing, because it is not the most important. So therefore, this misperception of the I existing as truly there, truly existing from the side of the I. Therefore, there's a sense it's the center of the universe, it's the center of everything, and then attachment arises, other afflictions arise, and all our problems are gradually generated.
아니 디나신 파게 나랑기 고아라던 신체바 라는 신체바 있는 이 딘데멘도 증도 마랑 신레디 테스트 타링 부지 신디 람레디 니부지 차 디지디 차다 디왕기 나레디 신다 니부지 차요 뭐지 제선다 디에 아니 랑다 신 세디 파게 이와체디 아니 민정기 류이 능취정기 이와체와마도 유기문이 이와 요말에 신타체는 랑대신 이링념 정도 디메나 아니 랑라디 니와다 신디 링아 차요디 니와치디 아니 콜레 신다 니와치 디리오 디지디 다 정원음 지송은 신이네다 얘기 선반의 신이네다 강들이야 디니가 딸 상당바이나 아니 말아 문을 주고 생바 다가란다 냠도 안가라 차고도 있게 뭐지 뒤념도 디지디 되샤던 덴진 총den도 예메스 다 신주 지거 다 정원음 시단의 예샤샤진 숨도 하는 주송지 안디 등원의 다음에 되고 주고 이제 등원의 때마다 교대스 다 간제 다디 신다 가리네 메네 다다 차바디 엔 당신들 총den도 다다 레통에 되지 제바이나 콩마 라드네 코라문의 주변 가지 철드네 여어디 차사로 아니 군인 송단의 시즌은 마 라드네 위디 차사로 길어디 코 차바디 깨살셔 다가라네 총den도
Also, the way I personally understand this, so this is something the way I look at it, that when we say I, there's right away a sense of closeness, whereas when we say others, there's a sense of further away. So the I is kind of close to oneself, others are further away from oneself. So if I and others are mere appearances, they're just merely appearing to the mind, well then I and others are equal. But without that, without the sense that the intrinsic, so I and others are not mere appearances, intrinsically I and intrinsically others, then there's a real sense that I is just closer to oneself. So here there are different explanations, whether what is Holiness said, the idea of this, the I, there's a sense of being the center of the universe, the center of everything, or the way I just explained it, there's a sense of I am closer to myself. So whatever one takes, whichever approach one takes, as long as one has a sense of the I existing from its own side, then at the same time as there's a sense of an I, there is attachment to that.
跟我只
So
是两
here
者
this
的
is
是
something
相
that is
应的，
holiness
说
also
我相
this
应的
idea
相
of
应
like
相应
the
成立的，同时
the
成立
attachment
的。
to the I
一有
is associated with or concomitant with. In other words, arises together in association
一
together
有我执，
with
像这种
the
我是
misperception
静，
of
它是
the
远
I.，This is
然后
something
或
that
者说
holiness
法文讲用法文
has
的意思
often
是我在中间，我
explained
是
that
核
they
心，
arise
这
together,
感觉
they're
就
part
同
of
时
one
产生。
awareness.
所以一有我
So
执，就是我在
therefore,
中间，我是比较靠
together,
近这种
and this
这
can
种
be
东西，
debated, this
一
is
有的同时，
debatable,
它对
whether
我的
actually
的
the
产生
grasping
了。
onto
这是
the
为什么
self
我们会
is
会解释
associated
说
with
呢
or？
我
concomitant
执
with
对我的还是
attachment.
同时
But
相
it
应
seems
产
the
生
way
的。
Holmes explains it, that there's a sense of a self existing from its own side. And due to that sense of a self, there's the sense that the I is the center of the universe and the I is closer to oneself.
一起对着呢，俺主到我们的西边，他大面的就是广播那样，俺人们的没把毛光呢，人们的越把真不的没把说图过嘛嘞，的没把什么图呢，他对下没把说图过嘛嘞，对下没把什么图不一呢，他靠叫我连的等等嘞，接图过嘛，他不图过嘛嘞，是的，如果的带什么当然多图钱，我之前不一呢。知道我们给他认为没把什么嘛单呢，他们特别习惯了，对下帮图过来是的，第二呢对下帮图过嘛嘞，可能是呢，人们的没把嘛单呢，人们的真把呢内接有嘛了，第二呢人们的主把的重点对下对当的信用的，对下等待他的有多，对下啥过去帮的嘛的，对下他的有呢，等待叫我领给的话是，这块呢他图面都是的，大家是我最接对切的话怎么应不去，我自己去图是了。
So, like according to the lower tenet explained that phenomena do exist from the outside. So, different from the lower tenet, we need to here understand that phenomena do not exist from their own side. Because understanding that, well, if there's no such sense of existence from its own side, then there's no attachment, there's no desire. And if and then there will be no problem, there's no rebirth in samsara, there's no suffering, there's no problem. So therefore, I double checked with Rinpoche about this. So with respect to the lower systems, as like different from the lower systems, he said yes, if we just go along with the lower tenet systems that do exist, do assert existence from its own side, that do say phenomena exist inherently, by denying the self that they deny, there will still be some attachment, some desire left. So by only denying the first type of self, but by not denying or by not refuting existence from its own side or inherent existence, there will be still some attachment left. There will be still problems and difficulties left. So therefore, it is important to think of the lack of inherent existence, the lack of existence from its own side, in order to totally remove the affliction and problems.
知道说呢，解释上部中观中的解释，为什么一定要修非有自方成立，才能够脱离轮回，这是有道理的。
但定的前用对咱呢，那个开始过来，东北给早晚的，当今的土壤的早晚西的人群需抓住不给，但，东北早晚的当今的土壤，定这个当今的怎么能行大的要的要嘛嘞？原来人生这个他的人生地那些点这个的，早晚西这个人群直接不给把点，但人生里面呢，点这下头我们都啊是，但。 이게最用的是那人性没能定着下图过来，人性原能定着下图嘛，类似要钱的，人家你去做西边话，在西边一点，第几对他经过那么去早些了嘛，第七用的，他个人都是贴切，你现在都说定了这些钱，我第送的话。
那因此呢，再介绍
Therefore, with regard to suffering, so what is the root of suffering? The root of suffering is the mind, is that innate awareness which grasps at the self. So this is explained, and that gives rise to the proposition. So that is explained in the 26th chapter of Nagarjuna's fundamental wisdom, Nagarjuna's root wisdom. And then understanding that innate self-grasping awareness, one then investigates, does the self, which is apprehended by that self-grasping awareness, does it exist or not? If it were to exist, it would have to be truly existing in one or truly existing different from the aggregate. That analysis is understood independent on the 18th chapter of the Fundamental Wisdom. And then, if the self does not exist inherently, if it does not exist intrinsically, nonetheless, it is possible to be dependently arisen, so it's a dependently arisen phenomenon. If it were to exist from its own side, if it were to exist intrinsically, it could not be dependently arisen. So this is then understood in dependence on the chapter of the Fundamental Wisdom, the 24th chapter. So as Hominis usually describes that kind of sequence of 26, 18, 24, and saying that the remaining chapters, they're just more extensive explanations on what has just been described.
Atijini, ani ta indijena ani tajalgi juldu thoya da juldu thoya ni ga lo phagi yuri ting de zega jona juma yimba chiba julme ba chiba ta yu yuan de chena ni ga lo jui thong chiba ina an chi jui ma res chi le julio de chi juyo ma yo de khandi chege res ta tiwa de li go ro.
So therefore, if it's not like that, if you talk about the snake and the rope, if there was truly something findable on the base, if now the phenomenon is just merely imputed, so when you have the snake and the rope, so you impute an actual snake on an actual rope, and you impute a snake on a rope. So in both cases, it's merely imputed. So how do you now differentiate between the snake being an actual snake, but the rope not being a snake?
So
then please look at the illumination of the thought by Lama Tsongkhapa, which is the second episode. So please look at your handout. There's still something left to read on exactly this topic. So it starts on page 2.
Odila ani bola soba nam tobe shalugi cha desamshi tabala judu tabada tawa yinjans tataki legi tobe shadang tobe wangi shadang shaba mato yugi ngeni zena ni yume bodi ta tabala judu tabada chibu chikyang res ro.
So here, if you read, this first part, so even though this is defined on the page 4 of your handout, even though only the manner in which a vase, etc., is posited by conceptual consciousness, is similar to the manner in which a snake is imputed on a rope, the vase and the rope snake are completely different. So here, therefore, here Geshe-la is saying, as he mentioned before, so if it's only imputed by conventional consciousness, by conceptual consciousness, so then if you search for something, something cannot be found. What is the difference between an actual snake and the snake that is merely imputed on a rope?
Tanda kandichiri muchi kundini tayo kor chirwa. Ani gomdin kija mari di chiba tela tene. Ani biji juni. Ani samdanda di kiji tone. Da ki subo da semda digi di ki mari dili losu mari. Samla di kowa da kiji yuni yores. Haha sisi chibu kiwa shade. Kaji tsurwaji liga da. Pagi munela chiba chibi tsurwadi da mari di. Tsurwaji liga. Kawa kanda samda tungma res. Tungma di kawa ya kya res. Tsujo dini kawa kya yo mari. Pajo dini kawa kya yo mari. Ta tungma di karis kya kawa di. Dini zeju di. Parasi tungma di mas tsaro che di soro. Tsaro dini si legi doa. Chisan ta kari inas. Ni tanan che di. Ta kengzen shindaya yo da yo chokurwa. Chik china rinpo chigi di da. Tobi shalu chikpa re. Si chik di. Kachingu chi nenjin sungu doa. Tendiki shukin tiki me ro sam tengi do.
他曾经在日宗林布切面前
So Ganmeti Rinpoche, Precious Ganmeti Rinpoche, so when he taught about the view of Madhyamika, the view of the middle way, so his students, even without meditating on what Rinpoche had explained, so by just attending to his class, what happened was when they came out of class or upon having attended the class, they would see a dog and apply the kind of reasoning, kind of like, what is the dog? Is it the tail? Is it the head? And kind of go, hoo-hoo, you know, what is the dog? Kind of like start laughing about this. There would be like this sense of, oh my god, how ridiculous, there's really no dog. So there was that sense, even without meditating, there was kind of a sense that this dog seemed to disappear. Or with respect to the pillar, having a pillar which supports a beam. So here there's an object that supports a beam. On the other side, there's not something that supports the beam. So what is it really that supports the beam? What is the pillar, etc.? So due to that kind of investigation, that is a result of having listened to Rinpoche's teachings, therefore there's a sense that the ceiling comes down because the pillars kind of disappear. So where does that come from? That strong sense that people after attending Rinpoche's class had the sense that things start dissolving. And Geshe was saying the reason for that is, what is the kind of decisive factor or the influencing factor was that Rinpoche very strongly emphasizes the fact that whether you talk about a snake being actually imputed as a snake, an actual snake basis being imputed as a snake, or a rope being imputed as a snake, the fact that they're merely imputed, designated by a conceptual consciousness is exactly the same. So Rinpoche strongly emphasized this point.
That Kasure Pumso Namdang and the Tabi Juni, that Pagule Shabachiva Inayang, a Yume Tagumare, Jawachi New Mini Tagumares, and Minda Jumzendela, and Tenigi Tanya Neighbor Jaku Mugu dance. Tanya Jebala, never Yume, so number Tamji do Mitsumbi City, any Kasure Tajala Julgi Tanya Neighbor to Jegomares, that Juldilla. 아니 줄기 타니 다 예보도 제고를 생기도 차도라 타니 예보도 자고 먹어다 아니 줄기 타니 제보들라 내가 요 말이스 타자를 줄기 타니 제보들라 아니 체마신기 내가 요레스 어디 숨어.
So then here it continues to say if they're completely different in terms of whether they exist or not, those two, so the difference between the vase and the rope snake. So here he's comparing an actual vase that is an actual vase and a rope snake which is actually not a snake. So they're completely different in terms of whether they exist or not, or whether or not they're able to perform the function of a vase or a snake, respectively. And so here then it goes on to say this is because these two differ in many ways, such as with regard to whether their verbal conventions must be used or not. Here they should use the example of a real snake and a rope that is called a snake. So a real snake, here you can apply the verbal convention snake. It can be applied to a real snake, which is imputed on the type of an actual snake. Whereas when you talk about the rope that is mistakenly designated or is perceived to be an actual snake, you cannot actually call it, you cannot use the verbal convention, you cannot use the word snake for it. So there's also this difference. So they're two different in that respect, and whether those conventions are susceptible to invalidation by valid cognition and so forth. So, in other words, here with regard to the actual snake, well, we can call it a snake. There's no valid cognition that kind of contradicts that. It's not contradicted by valid cognition. Whereas from the point of view of the snake that is mistakenly perceived to be a snake, the rope being perceived as a snake, there's a valid cognition that contradicts it being an actual snake.
and chel lo parche ani pattache anti thabarisha juje mindu se semandigi ani nima juje sha se de ne joro ne jode ta ma norshas nima juje tingor juje mindu se ji le guro cheza juje se de ne bare cheza ta juje se de la ani tinji ne gi chama mindu odiro.
So therefore with respect to now perceiving a rope as being an actual
虽然我
snake.
心里面想的
So
是
that is
这有蛇，
contradicted by
可
valid
是当
cognition
灯一
in the
亮的
sense
时候
that
呢，你就
if
看
I
到说
then
原来
switch
是
on the
蛇
light,
原来
in
是神
which
不是
the
蛇
rope,
那这
the
时候
kind
呢
of，coiled
你后
rope
来
is
这个
the
原来
room
是
in
蛇
which the
这
coiled
个
rope
链
is,
式呢
room
就
is.
会伤害到
Then when
本
I
来
go
你
to the place where that
说
coiled
白了
rope
就
is
是
and I look
当
closer,
灯亮了以后
I
呢，
can
你看
see
到
it's
说原来
actually
是
a
神
rope.
的这个
So
链
the
式，它就
awareness
会伤
that
害
the
到你
valid
本来觉得
cognizer
有蛇
that
的这个
perceives,
想
that
法。
correctly
所以那个
perceives
时候
a
你会想说
rope
啊，原来是神，
contradicts the
我
fact,
错了。那
contradicts
然后
that
错了
this
这个
rope
想法
is
出
an
来的时
actual
候，就是
snake.
说你
So
后来这个
therefore,
链式伤
the
害了你
rope,
本
the
来的那
rope
个想
snake
法
is，
这个叫做
contradicted by a
有危
valid
害。
cognizer, which
但
is
是
the
呢，如
valid
果是
cognizer
你把蛇当
apprehending
蛇的
the
话呢，
rope
就
as
不会有
being an
后来
actual
这种
rope.
不是蛇
However,
的这
in
个
the case of
想
a
法
snake,
来伤
when
害
there's
到
an
你本来
actual
认为
snake,
蛇是
when
蛇
you
的
impute
那
snake
个
on
那
the
个看
snake
法，这
body,
个叫做
then
无
there's
可
no
危
valid
害。
cognizer that apprehends that the snake is not a snake.
다오나 아니 주의딜에 파게 제일 민두 제도와 아니 주의시세 된디 컨디디레는 제가 저나 주의기 민두 왔어. 그러와 제사 아니 이 주민두 세지로 시기도 왔어. 라바이나 아니 가산 라바나 신 된디디 칸에 민두 라바이네 되라 무연의 세와 인사 아니 율기등도 세와 인사 율기 무연의 민두스 디주거로 따버점기 따버점 많이 비 율기 무연의 민두스 되다디 좋아 인사 아니 대경에를 두 레드 내용도 두 레드 가가로 타니도 있기지 시고 진짜 내용 말했어.
But if you may argue and you may say, well, with regard to the actual snake, imputing a snake on the snake body, well, when you go there and you check whether it's there, well, you also don't find it. When you look for it, what is the snake?